The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Unit 6 of the Lunch and Learn series for the Team Leader series. Welcome. Just want to make sure, do a quick sound check if I may. Could I ask you if you could just type in the word clear in the question box as normal, just so that I know that, thank you, Maxine. Thanks, Diana. Thanks, Gavin. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Lisa. Okay, all right, thank you. Sounds like I'm coming across loud and clear. So look, this is our last unit and we're going to look at developing team culture today. And I'm going to share with you, of course, a few insights and a few tools that you might be able to use in relation to developing a team culture. So let's get underway. And of course, if you've got questions, comments, observations, you know what to do. Type them in the question box as you've done there, and I'll deal with them as they arise. So, you know, whenever they come up, I'll see them. Remember, I'm the only one that gets to see the questions, but nevertheless, I'll address them as soon as I see them. So make sure that you keep that in mind, because there'll be no room at the end of the presentation for questions necessarily. All right, so let's have a quick recap. So we've started out our journey several weeks ago, and we're looking at the characteristics of high-performing teams, and I shared with you 8 characteristics. We then looked at the 4 stages of team development, and I basically used Tuckman's model of forming, storming, norming, and performing. We then looked at tools for leading teams, and essentially the message out of Unit 3 was the whole need to balance task and relationship. And certain situations require more task focus, certain situations require more relationship focus. In Unit 4, we looked at the roles people play in teams, and I've had a bit of correspondence about that. I used the team management profile as an example to demonstrate the roles that people play in teams. But unfortunately, in this series, that's not available for you to complete as a diagnostic. But if you're interested in doing that, by all means, send me an email and I can link you up with team management systems and you can complete that. In Unit 5, you did complete a diagnostic, and that was the conflict resolution diagnostic. And really, it showed you that there were 5 different ways of dealing with conflict. And your profile demonstrated to you what your preferred style was. And my point was that you shouldn't be overusing that style. And what you should be doing, of course, is using all 5 approaches. And of course, we're up to developing team culture today. So just to recap from last time, 2 weeks ago, we looked at Thomas Kilman's model. Thomas Kilman had identified 5 particular ways of dealing with conflict. And you'll notice that there was a tension between assertiveness and cooperativeness. You might recall I shared with you 5 case studies and asked you how you might resolve those. So that became quite relevant as such. So just got a message here. Yeah, okay. Yeah, Sean, I sent you an email this morning about that, but I can give you the details for sure. So perhaps you might just respond to my email and I'll send you through the details. Okay, now your homework, of course, was to try to practice all 5 approaches. Now, being a team leader, of course, you'd have plenty of opportunity to do that. And hopefully you've been more conscious and aware of when you're overusing one of those particular 5 styles and perhaps where you're underusing one of those 5 styles. And the whole idea is, if plan A doesn't work, try plan B, try plan C, keep going until you can find an approach that might work. So essentially that's what that was about, your homework. So I hope you got some useful insight out of that and got an opportunity to practice those 5 styles. So let's look at what we're doing today. So first of all, I want to define what culture is. I think when people talk about workplace culture or team culture, people have different ideas about what it is. So I need to define what I mean by culture. And then I want to talk about some strategies for developing team culture. So some very practical, simple things that you can do that will make a big difference in terms of improving the culture of a team. I should also point out that your team right now has a culture. It may not be a productive culture, but it has a culture. So all teams have a culture. So it's about modifying or changing or developing a team culture, not actually inserting a culture in the team. And I want to finish up with some of my work on my latest book I'm working on now, which is looking at team identity and how you might actually, so this is, well, it's not even hot off the press because I haven't even got a publishing contract yet. So you're privy to some information that you're getting very early on before this book's published. And then we're done. So that's where we're going for the next 45, 50 minutes. So let's define what we mean by culture. What do I actually mean by culture? So here's a definition. Of course, if you Google team culture or organizational culture, you will get thousands of different definitions. But this is a definition I think might serve us well for the duration of our webinar today. The basic pattern, so there is a pattern which basically means that this continues on, of shared assumptions, values and beliefs. All right, so the key thing about that message is that there are assumptions, values and beliefs, which of course are in our head. So it's things that people carry around with them. It's not necessarily written on a wall or anything like that. It's the way people like to do things. And they consider this the correct way of thinking. Now, I say correct because it's correct in the context of that team, but if you put someone in another team, that might not be considered to be the correct approach, way of thinking and acting on problems and opportunities facing the team. So it's kind of like a code of conduct, if you like, or it's a kind of a unwritten set of guidelines or rules or whatever that people will adhere to. And so I'm going to talk about that a little bit more detail, but it's, as I said before, it's not something that, I mean, if I walked in and I had a look at your team and I watched how they operated, I could probably work out what the culture was by the way people were doing things, but it would take a while to do that because it's not written on a wall. People may not even be able to articulate it to me, but really it's the way people do things. So in plain English, it's the way people do things and it's the acceptable way of behaving in a team context. Take that person out of a team and they might be slightly different in another context. So that's my definition. And just to underline my point about the unknown or the hidden, if you think about culture as an iceberg in the water, so an iceberg in the water normally has the tip of the iceberg that's out and it's very obvious and people can see it. But underneath the water, there's a whole lot of other factors that go with team culture. So if you actually consider team culture in the context of an iceberg, you'll notice that there are several things that people will be able to pick up very quickly by just observing a team. So for example, it might be the uniforms that people wear, it might be the physical location where the team is, the language that's used in the team, is there a degree of formality or, formality or informality? What sort of rituals and ceremonies do people celebrate birthdays and have morning teas? Are there certain stories and legends in terms of how people communicate with each other? So that's very obvious, and that's something that you can observe, or anyone could observe just looking at a team. But underneath the waterline, there's a whole bunch of other things that are not so obvious, and these are the beliefs and the values and the assumptions that hold the team together. Now, this would take a little bit of digging to be able to identify what they are. I'll give you an example. There was one person who joined an organisation not long ago, which will remain nameless, and this person clearly wanted to create a good impression. So they decided to, work back until 6:30 at night. Every night most people would leave at 5, they'd work through till 6:30. And in fact, what they found was that somebody had confronted them in the team and suggested to them that they might like to leave at 5 o'clock, one of their team members, because it was showing them up, and that, we have an acceptable practice here that we finish at 5 o'clock. So this person was pressured into leaving on time because the rest of the team, or at least one person pointed out that the rest of the team felt that it would be showing them up if they hung around and worked longer hours. So these things can be positive or negative, of course, and it can be very, very subtle. So think about culture as something that can be seen and something that can be unseen. Now, the question really is, well, why would a team have a certain brand or way of doing things? What's the purpose of a culture? Why does a team have a culture, whether it's a positive culture or a negative culture? And essentially, there are a couple of reasons for this. I mean, one of the reasons that a team has a culture is it serves as a sense-making mechanism. So it basically lets people know where the train tracks are, where the line in the sand is, what's acceptable and unacceptable behaviour in that team context. And of course, we all know that people like boundaries, and we've talked about this earlier in the Lunch and Learn series. So going clockwise around here, around this model, you can see that defining the boundaries of what's acceptable and unacceptable behaviour in a team is important, and that's one of the reasons that we have a culture, so that people can kind of understand how far they can go. So the example I used before, where somebody was told not to stay back after 5 o'clock, the boundary obviously there was that people finish work at 5 o'clock, and they were told in no uncertain terms that it would be showing people up if they stayed longer. So that person was pressured into pressured into leaving at 5 o'clock, even though perhaps they felt that they wanted to stay longer. It also serves as a sense of identity, and all teams have got a sense of identity. Some of those identities are very obvious and some of them are not. So for example, in a military context, the SAS, which has a very strong culture in the military, the elite services in the military, it's a very secretive culture. It's one where people feel very comfortable being part of that. And there's certain conventions and ways of means of doing things. Excuse me for a moment. That's better. Committing, it also provides people to make commitments beyond self-interest, because culture normally lets people know that you're not just an individual here, you're part of a team, and we expect you to do certain things in the interests of the team. So that could even include situations where people don't so-called dob on each other. So that's quite a possible way that self-interest can be curbed, that we don't dob on somebody if they do the wrong thing. And of course, the culture, all of these things add up to stability. So by having a culture, the team has a degree of stability. So when someone new comes into a team, they're watching and observing behaviour, they're listening to what people say, they're trying to get a gauge on what the culture is, what's the acceptable practice of the team. And this gives them a sense of stability so that they can fit in more effectively in a team culture. So that adds to a degree of, I guess, comfort, if you like, in being part of the team. So it's important that we have a culture. The question really is, what sort of culture should we have in a team? Now, one of the exercises that's really a lot of fun and is very, very effective is this exercise. And I'd suggest perhaps at one of your team meetings that you devote some time to asking the team 3 questions. So you actually have a team conversation. And it's a fun exercise, and you'll find that it'll be very revealing. So, for example, you might ask them these 3 questions. If you had to describe our team, which is what you would say, of course, to your team members, as a colour, what colour would it be and why? So the metaphor is a colour. So you ask people to describe the colour and then why people would say that. I'll give you a couple of examples. I did a job for Queensland Rail many years ago, and they were going through a difficult patch. Sounds like they might be doing that at the moment. And I asked them what colour, and the conventional colour was black. And I said, why? And they said, well, we're not terribly exciting. We're, we work in a very regulatory environment. There are rules and regulations for everything, and people must adhere to those. And safety is a critically important aspect of that. So you can see that, people have identified with a certain culture. I also asked IBM, and this is when IBM was in their heyday, and I was doing some work for IBM, and they said gold. And I said, why? And they said, well, we're number one in the marketplace, and we want to stay as number one. So you can see that it's a metaphor for opening up a conversation about why. The second question you can ask is, if you had to describe your team as an animal, what animal would it be and why? So again, another metaphor is an animal. And again, going back to the Queensland Rail example, I was told that the animal that best describes QR at the time was an elephant. And you could probably envisage why, slow to change. And also there was another interesting one, never forgets, holds grudges. So that was interesting. And then for IBM, it was a cheetah, fast moving, agile, and so forth. So they had a different perspective on themselves as an organisation, in fact, polar opposite to QR. And the third question you can ask in the team meeting is, if you had to describe your team as a motor vehicle, what vehicle would it be and why? Now, again, go back to the QR example. The example that I got was a Holden. And at the time when people explained it to me, they said that, well, my father worked here and my grandfather worked here, and it's kind of a bit of a family type organisation. And that was the reason that they explained it that way. And then I asked IBM the same example, the same question, and they said a Ferrari with all the bells and whistles, again, because we're, top performers, we are at the top of our game and so forth. So try this and confine the comments to your team. So if you use this organisationally, you'll get some muddled responses. But if you just simply ask your team to describe the team as a colour, a animal and a vehicle, and then just go around the table and listen to what people have got to say. And of course, there's no right or wrong answers. And what you'll find is some very obvious themes come up. And that's a great exercise to get a discussion going about team culture. If you want to, you could take it to the next level and say, now, if we could have the ideal team, what colour would it be? What animal and what vehicle? So what you actually, and so there'll probably be a gap between where they see themselves and where they want to be. And then the question then is around, well, what can we do as a team to transition from where you see us to where we need to be? What do I need to do as a leader? What do you need to do? How can we move from A to B? That is a really great exercise to do. And you can find that that will stimulate discussion for 20, maybe 25, 30 minutes if you've got the time to do that. So that's a great way of getting your team involved in developing a culture that everybody's pleased with, and also getting a bit of a rain check on where the team sees themselves right now in terms of culture. So if you've got any questions or comments about that exercise, I'm more than happy to try to respond to that. Now, what you're seeing on your slide, and you'll see this very soon, it'll come up, there's always a delay here. What you'll see is that another, as you can see now, there's here's some key dimensions of organisational culture. So if you wanted to do this in a bit more detailed or scientific way, what we've got here is Robbins' criteria. And what Robbins and his colleagues have done is they've identified some parameters around team culture. And you could actually get team members to rate these on a scale of 1 to 5. 5 is high, 1 is low. So have a look at these parameters and consider these. So, for example, how much individual liberty or freedom do people have to make decisions in the team? If it's a high autonomous team, such as a sales team where people can make their decisions about who they call upon, where they spend their time, then clearly they'd rate that a 4 or a 5. But if it's a tightly controlled environment, it might be a 1 or a 2. Risk tolerance, the degree to which employees are encouraged to take risks. Now, obviously, in an organisation that's very safety conscious, you would probably find the risk tolerance there would be quite low. So that may be a 1 or a 2. But where people are actually encouraged genuinely to take risks, then you would probably rate that a 4 or a 5. The direction, the degree to which the team creates clear objectives. So the clarity around what's expected of the team, the milestones and parameters that the team operate in. If that was scored a 4 or a 5, it would be very crystal clear to people what's expected of them. And of course, that would be partially the nature of the work that people conduct. The integration, the degree to which the team is encouraged to operate in a coordinated manner, and that is with other aspects of the organisation and with themselves. So is it really a team of individuals, or is it a team in a genuine sense? How would people rate that integration? The contact that management has with the team, is that the degree to which the manager actually provides clear communication and assistance and support. So if the team leader, that's you, of course, is very hands-on, then clearly the score there would be a 4 or 5. Or if you're working in a professional services firm, it's highly likely that there'll probably be a lower score on that, because the team leader is working with professionals such as engineers or accountants, and therefore they're quite confident that those people have got the necessary skills to be able to make their own decision, and that the leader is really there just to guide and inform on a needs basis. The degree of control, that is the rules and regulations and the amount of direct supervision that are used to oversee and control employee behaviour. So perhaps in a government type organisation, that may well be higher because of the very nature of the regulatory environment that a department might operate in, whereas in a startup IT firm, that could be quite low. Identity, the degree to which members identify with the organisation as a whole, or should put there the team as a whole rather than the particular work group. So how, if you ask people, where do you work, would they be likely to say organisational, give the name of the organisation, or would they be likely to talk about the team within the organisation? Again, what would that be rated? Reward systems, the degree to which rewards are allocated on the basis of performance criteria. Now, if everyone's paid the same, and regardless of the input that people give, then clearly that would be rated low. But of course, if people are getting bonuses for the work that they produce in a team environment, then obviously that would be rated highly. The conflict tolerance, so the degree to which employees are encouraged to air their conflicts and criticisms openly. So if people have robust conversations in your team, are willing to put things on the table, then clearly that would be a 4 or a 5. But if people kind of sweep things under the carpet and things aren't really discussed in any great way, in fact, we bypass them and there are elephants in the room that are not being discussed, then it's likely that the conflict tolerance would be reasonably low. So you see that, that of course directly relates to our previous unit 5 on conflict and negotiation. And what about the communication patterns, the degree to which organisational communication is restricted to formal lines of hierarchy? So you as the team leader might get upset if somebody in your team goes and bypasses you and talks to your boss, or perhaps your colleague in another team if it's a larger organisation. So how formal are the lines of communication, or is it reasonably informal and people can make their own contacts and choose to do that? So you can rate that on a scale of 1 to 5 as well. So Robin's model obviously is far more detailed than the one that I gave you previously around colour, vehicle and animal. Both of them are effective. It just depends on your approach and your style and which you prefer to use. I think if you want to get a team conversation going, the first one is probably more applicable. That is the colour, animal and vehicle. But if you really want to do some sort of an analysis on your team and get some numbers around it to give you some indicators of where you might be able to make some changes in the team, you could quite readily put this together from the slides that you'll receive later on, perhaps on the weekend, I'd suggest, not today. Then you can get people to rate these things on a scale of 1 to 5. And then perhaps you can consider whether or not they are applicable to the environment that you're working in. And remember this, the organisation you're working in has a huge bearing on the sort of culture that your team exhibits, obviously by the nature of the work and so forth. So many of these things are part of the organisational fabric, and therefore there's not much you can do about it at the team level. But obviously if any of these are actually counterproductive in terms of the team output, then of course you can address those and look for ways of remedying that. So this is a good tool to be able to get a rain check, if you like, on how the team's actually performing at the moment. So I'd highly recommend it to you. I think it's a great tool to consider and how you might go about doing that. So if you've got any questions, any comments, observations, welcome to make comments at this stage. So there's two very practical tools. And what those two tools do, in essence, is give you a rain check on where the organisation is right now. Bear in mind, as the team leader, you might find that other people have got a different point of view to you. And don't be surprised about that, because obviously you've got a different perspective on it because you're the team leader. But it'd be very interesting, of course, to hear what the team themselves think about many of those things. You do have some control over culture, but don't just remember this, that your team also has some control over culture, as does the external influences of the organisation and so forth as well have an influence on culture. Now, a very famous article was written several years ago now by O'Reilly and his colleagues. It's a wonderful title, and it was published in the Harvard Business Review, and it was called The Ambidextrous Organisation. And I love it because if you think about someone that's ambidextrous, say, for example, in sport, it basically means that you can do things with both hands. So if you're a tennis player and you're ambidextrous, you can play tennis either left-handed or right-handed, pretty much at the same level of competence. So ambidexterity is the ability to use both left and right-handed in a fairly coordinated way. But when we talk about an ambidextrous team or an ambidextrous organisation, what we're saying is that we can do two things at the same time in our team. So what O'Reilly was talking about is that to be an effective team in the 21st century, a team needs to have two qualities going for it. On the one hand, if I can use the pun, say on the left hand, and you can see on your screen, the team needs to have processes and procedures in place. In other words, the team needs to have a train track and a way of doing things. So this is the way we do business. These are the processes we use. This is the paperwork we fill out. These are the the procedures that we adhere to as a team in order to produce the product or the service that we do. So a team obviously needs to have some regulation around that. Now, any team that doesn't, of course, will fly by the seat of its pants, and it's not ideal because it means that there are no clear processes that we need to follow. So clearly a team needs to have that. However, that becomes dominant, that hand in other words, say that left hand, what happens is that when opportunities arise to take advantage of new opportunities, the team is hamstrung for the simple reason that the hand that's quite regulatory is actually dominant. So people are risk averse. People aren't making decisions when they need to. People aren't chancing their arm, so to speak. Again, pardon the pun. There's all of those possibilities. So the right hand, in this case here, is about the team having an ability to be innovative, continuously improving, looking at their systems, always constantly improving their capacity to do things, being flexible, being agile, all of those sorts of things. Now, what O'Reilly is saying is that the challenge for any team in the 21st century, regardless of whether it's public sector, private sector, or not-for-profit, the challenge for the team in the 21st century is to be both right-handed and left-handed. In other words, you should have systems and processes in place, but you should also be able to have another set of values around exploratory, what he calls exploratory, which is around that innovation and growth and change. So this is another lens that you might like to look at your team through and consider, which is the dominant hand. And of course, the nature, if you're a government agency, for example, then clearly the left hand is going to dominate because it's taxpayers' money. People are expecting that there are going to be rules, regulations, processes and procedures and frameworks. People expect that. But if those rules, regulations, procedures and frameworks are so dominant that it doesn't allow the organisation to be exploratory, which is the right hand, then that's going to mean that the team's going to be less effective because there are opportunities that arise where a team can explore new ways of doing things. Okay, and of course, if you're public sector and it's if you're private sector, I should say, you might find that the right hand's dominant. So might be a startup IT firm, as I mentioned earlier. The startup IT firm basically means we just fly by the seat of our pants. We take on jobs as they turn up. We make up systems on the run. Now, that's not ideal either, because obviously, sooner or later we're going to have some degree of stability in the team in order to operate effectively. So this is a very interesting concept, because what O'Reilly is really talking about is the need to be ambidextrous. So the question you might like to ask yourself, is your team actually truly ambidextrous? Can you, on the one hand, be sticking to processes and procedures, but on the other hand, when the opportunity arises, are you able to flick the switch, if you like, to being quite innovative and agile and exploratory? That's another way, another lens that you might like to look at your team. Now, all these things, as I said, is contextualized around the business or the organisation you're in. But you might like to consider that as an interesting approach. Now, a lot of this is a reflection of you as the team leader, and you will have a bias towards a left hand or a right hand. And so you need to consider this carefully. Where is your bias? Can you recognize it? Probably at one level you would acknowledge that what I'm saying is true, but then again, in practice, you may well be a left-hander or a right-hander. So the question you need to ask is my bias actually influencing the team? And could I possibly rein in that bias so that I can get both hands operating and indeed become ambidextrous? So that's another model you might like to consider. And if you Google ambidextrous organisation, you'll get that article on Google, I'm sure. So that'll be fairly straightforward. Okay. Now, one of the models I put together on one of the books I wrote, which was Performance Management for Agile Organisations. If you're looking, say, for example, we just talked about left and right-handed. Now, the right hand, of course, is the is the agility hand in this case. Here's a way of looking at it. I found it interesting that we talk a lot about agility, but we don't, we haven't really defined it. So I had a crack at this and thought, well, I'll try and define what it is, and obviously wrote a book about it. So let me go through this with you very quickly, because you might like to look at becoming more right-handed, which is more agile. And if you were going to do that, you can go a little bit deeper and actually consider your team in the context of these dimensions. So for example, up the top, going clockwise, how innovative is your organisation? How quickly can you innovate? Or do you have people saying things like, if it ain't broke, don't fix it? Or we have a system in place, follow it. So is your ability to come up with new and better ways of doing things hamstrung by the the left hand of your organisation, or indeed your team? How quickly are you able to process things in your team? So when information comes in and you've got to process something, and we're all in the business of processing something, how quickly are you able to do that? Or does it take a long time? Are you reliant on other teams in the organisation to get you the resources you need to make decisions? What could you do to make yourselves more process speedy, if you like? How can you get things done in a faster way? Now, the third one there is very interesting. We all make mistakes. Teams make mistakes. You make mistakes. I make mistakes. We all make mistakes. The question not is how do we, I guess the ultimate question is how do we stop ourselves making mistakes? But the reality is no matter what we do as human beings, we will make mistakes. The real question is how do we recover quickly when a mistake is made? That's a part of agility. So, for example, if you go into a restaurant and you order a meal and you get the wrong meal, and you explain to the waiter that you've got the wrong meal, how quickly they can shift the emphasis, get you the new meal that you're after, how quickly they can recover from their mistake, will have a huge bearing on the level of forgiveness that you have in that organisation. So obviously if they come back to you in about 10-15 minutes with the right meal, and you may be more forgiving than you would if they argue with you, for example, that you gave us the wrong order. It was your fault as the customer, which we see that all the time, unfortunately. Continuous improvement at the bottom there is around how we can actually look at our systems and processes and procedures and question whether we're doing it right or not. Is there a better way? Is there a faster way? Is there an easier way? Is there a way that will get a better result? Is there a more cost-effective approach? All of these questions are related to continuously improving the capacity of the team to perform. Customer responsiveness. How responsive is your team to the customers? Now, customers, of course, are not all external. You've got customers internal and external. And the question you've got to ask yourself is genuinely, how responsive are we to our customers? Really, ultimately, your team should adopt the mantra that everything we say, think, and do should be in the best interests of the customers we serve. Now, of course, in reality, that doesn't always happen for a whole range of reasons. So you might like to monitor yourself around customer responsiveness. How quickly are you able to resolve problems in your team? So when a problem and dilemma comes up that's a bit unusual and you can't follow the process, there isn't a set process, how quickly are you able to resolve that? Or do you, take too long? Or do other people think that you take too long? And the last one there is changing direction. How quickly is your team's capacity to change direction when it needs to? So all of a sudden you get a new order or a new problem is put on your table and you've got to change tack quickly. Your priorities have to change. How quickly can your team be agile enough to move into a different direction depending on the needs that they have? So the model that I'm sharing with you is unique, well, it's my model, it's original but what I've tried to do there is identify 7 dimensions that are critically important to the right hand, which is that agile hand, and that you might like to do some monitoring in your team around those areas as well. Anyone got any questions, any comments, any observations? You're very quiet today. Maybe it's Friday, who knows? But if you've got any comments or questions, I'm happy to hear those. All right, let's move on. Now, one of my favourite tools that I designed was a way of you developing a culture in your team in terms of the way people deal with each other. So this is a really good tool. Again, you would do this in a team meeting. And so what you would do is you'd ask everyone to come to the meeting with a pen and a paper. Hopefully they do that anyway, or if they've got a laptop, whatever, they can basically record some answers. And then when you get them around the table, you ask them essentially 4 questions, and we call this a team values charter. Now, what I mean by this is that it gives the team an opportunity to be able to define how they deal with each other. So this is not in violation of your organisational values, and I know your organisations have a set of values. This is a completely different thing. This is really about how each team member a code of behaviour around how each team member will deal with each other in the pursuit of whatever you do as a team. So it's just about how people treat each other, in other words. And here are the questions that you can ask. And of course, you respond to these as well as the team leader. So set the tone and make sure you've got a response to each of these 4 questions. But you ask these questions in a team meeting and you ask people to write down the answers. Why? Because you want them to think about it and you want them to process it. And that's important. So it's not, make sure that they write their answers down. So the very first question you would ask in the team values charter is, what is one value that is important to you when working in this team? Now I might say, for example, as I've said on the screen there, respect. So I write down the word respect because that's a value that I think is critically important when I'm working in this team. All right, so you look up, make sure everybody's ready to go, and remember they can only have one value. The second question you ask is, what is your definition of that value? So, because, a word can mean different things to different people. So if I write down the word respect, for instance, I might say respect is when people are prepared to listen to others, even when they do not agree with their point of view. So that's my definition of respect, which is fair enough. So, you get people to actually write that answer down. Okay, question number 3. Once they've done that, the next question that you ask is, why is that value important to you? Now, why ask that question? Well, it's important as a team leader to glean some insight into why people actually have identified that as an important value. So I might say, for example, as I'm writing my answers, I might say, I like to feel that I'm respected, and my value and my opinions valued when working with others. So that's my definition. So you see, that's why, and that's great because obviously you get to hear why people have identified that as a value. And the final question, where the rubber meets the road, is you would ask, what behaviors would be consistent with that value? So I might say that in my mind, if someone was showing respect in my team, I would suggest that they're not interrupting people when they're in the middle of whatever they're saying. So we give people the courtesy of hearing them out before we might in fact disagree with them later on. So that might be my definition of respect in practice as a value. Now, this is great. You get people to do this, and then what you do is you simply go round the table and ask. You start with yourself, by the way, so you set the tone, and then you go round the table and you invite everyone to respond to those 4 questions because they've written them down, so they're not blindsided. They've already thought about the answers, And you then will gain, what your job then is to gain a bit of a conversation around each of those values. All the while, ask somebody to record those values. You really record the first two items. So what are the values and what are the definitions? Now, so you may find that more than one person has the same value. Not a problem. In fact, that's a good thing because it identifies there's some synergy in the team already. So that's not a problem. You can actually get those people to get their heads together and work out what a definition would be that would cover both of their versions of that value, because they're probably slightly different. You get everyone to read those out and you create what we call a team values charter. Now, I've done this in lots of organisations, as a consultant coming in, and what I've found is that it's really, really powerful, because the key thing out of this is that people don't argue with their own data. In other words, they will 100% embrace the values because they have had a stake in the setting of those. And that's why values, the plaque on the wall and all the rest of it, doesn't really work very well, because really that's been designed by a couple of people behind closed doors, and then they're expecting everybody to sort of adhere to those. And of course, the key thing is that no one had a say in it except a couple of key people in the organisation. This way, everyone gets a stake in this. Now, I would even go so far as publishing this, right? So I'd actually decide that I'm going to, well, you can even go so far as putting it as a plaque on the wall in your meeting room, for example. Or you can put it on your agenda items, or you can use it in lots of ways. You will find surprisingly effective and very, very good. And when you know it's really working is that when the team themselves hold each other accountable for those values. But it also, as a team leader, gives you some scaffolding. It gives you another way of being able to approach issues. So, for example, if somebody's behaved that perhaps wasn't consistent with the values charter, you can actually ask them, do you think this is consistent with our values? And you can do that with some authority because clearly you have published this charter. So that's a great tool, and I strongly recommend that you consider using that. Now, I'm going to finish up with, as I said earlier on, right at the beginning, with this is original material that I have put together. Well, the values charter is original as well, but I wanted to talk about team identity. Your job is to create a team identity. And how you do that is you can either do that accidentally or you can do it on purpose. But whatever way you do it, you'll have a team identity. The question is it productive or unproductive? So here's three things that you might like to think about. 3 words, all starting with B, so they're easy to remember. Bridging, buffering, and building. So, as a team leader, you've got a responsibility to bridge, buffer, and build. So what do I mean by bridge, buffer, and build? Okay, bridging is building productive alliances up with other stakeholders within and outside the organisation. No team works in isolation, and what's critically important for you is to make sure that you have good channels of communication going on with various stakeholders internally and externally. Because if you don't have good channels of communication, then people will avoid communicating with you. They may forget to communicate with you. They may choose not to communicate with you on purpose. You're going to have some problems. Your team performance will suffer as a result of that. So as the team leader, you need to build bridges between your team and other teams. So that's the very first thing. It's really important that that actually happens. So how good are you at bridging? How good are you at reaching out to other stakeholders in your team? And how good are you taking and adopting and taking on board ways and means of improving that communication channel? Buffering is the opposite, actually. Buffering is where you insulate your team from outside forces. Now, you might think this is contradictory, but if you don't put some sort of protection around your team, and I'm not talking about a physical boundary, but if you don't put some protection around your team, what will happen is that people will pilfer your resources, right? So they might take your equipment, or they might use some of your personnel, and you end up suffering as a team. So in some sense, you've got to buffer your team from outside forces and influences. You can have these two things working in tandem, so you can bridge and buffer at the same time, and you should. But buffering is not being completely uncooperative with other aspects of the team. It simply means making sure that you protect the team and its resources from undue influence from outside. And that's important. And I guess as a team leader, you need to be able to do that effectively. Of course, you have a responsibility to be a team player beyond the team. And of course, there are things that are required to be done. But the fact is, if you don't buffer, what will happen is that people will actually take advantage of your team. Now, the final one is building. Now, building is about internally building a team identity. And a lot of the concepts that I've gone through today are actually around building. So the team values charter is building a clear, constructive culture around how people will deal with each other. Considering the ambidextrous organisation is a building mechanism. Surveying your team and building on what you've discovered in terms of the way people see themselves is a building activity. So you can see that these three balls have to be in the air at once. And if any of those balls drop, then your team is less is suboptimal. It's not going to be a high performing team. If you do any of these in their extreme, you will create problems for yourself. So for example, if you spend too much time buffering, in other words, completely isolating your team from the influences of outside forces, you will isolate the team literally to a point where other parts of the organisation or external won't communicate with you. So this is always a juggling act. You never get this completely right. It's always tinkering with bridging, buffering and building. All right, so folks, that's pretty much it at this stage. I do have time to take some questions if you've got questions. So by all means, fire away. Or perhaps you might like to tell me what you got out of today's session, which you might find useful. So while you're thinking about that, of course, you can imagine what your homework is. It's really around implementing a team culture strategy. So using the tools I've given you today, now clearly you don't have to use them all, and you really won't have the time to use them all, but which of those two tools really made a lot of sense to you, and what can you use, how can you use them to help you create an even more productive team culture than you currently have? There's a heap of tools there that are very useful for you. Where do you start? Do you need to get a handle on what the team culture looks like? If you've got a handle on that, perhaps you might like to think about the ambidextrous organisation. Or perhaps your team members, being reasonably new, need to develop a team values charter so that we can develop a way of communicating with each other that is mutually respectful, or whatever it might be. So it's very important that you consider all of those things. Lisa just makes the comment here that thanks, Tim. The practical exercises look like they'll be useful. I like the team charter. Great. Go ahead and try it, Lisa. You'll be absolutely blown away at how effective it is. It's not just some theoretical exercise. It's really, really powerful. Sean says that looking forward to using the colour, animal and vehicle task. Brilliant. It works really well. You'll be amazed at the conversation it builds, Sean, and your team will actually appreciate it as well. Catherine says, I feel like the challenge is really in the juggling, both for left versus right hand and the three team identity elements. Do you have any advice for feeling and judging which ones to use in which circumstances. Not really. It's a bit of work in progress, Catherine. I'm actually writing the book at the moment on that. I'm obviously going to provide solutions to all this, but I think, I guess it's a mental framework to keep in mind that you probably recognise that those three things are critically important. It's just making sure that you've got some degree of balance. But you'll get feedback. I mean, you'll get feedback from around the place around how effective each of those three are going. The key is just to keep your eyes and ears open for that feedback as such. Lisa says, good to remind the people are more likely to adopt something that they've thought for themselves. Yeah, okay, good point, Lisa. Catherine says, thanks, very good frameworks. So thanks, guys. That's pretty much it from me. Look, final thing, thank you. I've really enjoyed working with you. Thanks, Jane. Appreciate that feedback. I've really enjoyed working with you in the Lunch and Learn series. I hope that it's been useful for you. I hope that your team will benefit. I hope that you benefit as a team leader as well. I think that's really important, and I'd ask you to apply some of the things that you've learned. So if you got something out of the Lunch and Learn, by all means, and there are other people in your organisation that would like to be involved, send me an email and I can send out the details for the next series when it comes up. And bear in mind, I have 3 series. This is the Team Leader series, I have the Team Manager series, and I have the Executive series. So it's not like this is the only series. So there's a lot of them, and I'm developing them all the time. So if you've got people who are open to this, you know where to find me, of course. How long till we access the recordings? I'll send them out tomorrow, Jane, I promise. So you'll have them, if you check your emails over the weekend, you'll have them Saturday afternoon. If you don't, you'll have them on Monday morning. So it gives you a bit of an idea. Okay, all right, so that's about it from me. Thank you very much, everyone, and I guess have a wonderful weekend, and thank you very much for your involvement in the Lunch and Learn. I've appreciated working with you. Thank you and goodbye.